All right, I'm in Port Richmond, Philadelphia, and I'm headed up towards Fishtown, Philadelphia. So I'm gonna go up Lehigh Avenue. I think I'll go a little bit through some of the smaller streets this time, just so you can get a sense of, well, what the smaller streets look like. Usually I go up the pretty big streets. So what I want to talk about today are some tips for mental training in jiu-jitsu. Stuff that you can do to keep your mind sharp and active and develop mental skills in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So one of the pieces of advice that I give my students a lot of the time, sorry, I'm going to put on gloves. It's very, very chilly. Okay, one glove. I just got to get one more on. Sorry about the hand. So one of the pieces of advice that I give my students when they're watching jiu-jitsu, sitting on the side of the mat or watching competition footage or whatever, is when you're watching, number one, you want to try to put yourself in the situation that you're watching. So if you're watching Todd roll with Janine, and Janine has Todd in leg lasso and she's working towards a sweep to Todd's right side, you want to try to put yourself in one of their situations, especially if it's a position that you play regularly and are invested in trying to improve on. And when you put yourself in their shoes, then, all right, let me just make sure I can cross the street. Okay, cool. When you put yourself in their shoes, it gets you into this mindset of, what would I do in this situation? How would I deal with Janine's spider guard? Or if I'm pretending to be Janine, how would I sweep Todd if he bases out with his right foot, bases out with his left foot, etc.? And then when you put yourself in that situation, you can study, okay, well, what are some of the problems that Jeannie is coming across when she tries to sweep Todd? Maybe Todd is leaning his head to the left too far and she can't take him over. Maybe Todd is using a certain grip, stripping her grips off somehow, stepping on the hamstring and pulling his hand free. So it puts you in the mindset of imagining yourself in that person's shoes, which is sort of a type of, I think it's a type of like enhanced visualization. Another way to get value out of a similar situation when you're watching is to try to predict what's going to happen next. So again, if Janine has Todd in lasso guard and it looks like she's trying to take him to her left side for a sweep by underhooking his left leg with her right arm, what do you think is going to happen next? You think Todd's going to lean to his left and make it harder for her to sweep him in that direction? If he does lean to the left, what do you think she's going to follow up with? And one of the great things about this is that it's kind of a way to pop quiz your knowledge of a certain position or a certain situation. If you have ready answers for what you think is going to happen, good candidate moves, then you can generally, with some accuracy, predict what's going to happen with skilled practitioners. And again, you're never going to be 100% when you predict, because there's just too many variables to calculate. But usually you can get yourself to the point where you can kind of predict one of 3 or 4 things is going to happen. Like, okay, he's on top of spider guard, her leg lasso, and she's trying to sweep him to his right, so he's going to lean to his left. And then once he leans to his left, he's going to try to get the spider guard foot out of the bicep using a knee or stepping on the hamstring. And then once he does that, he's probably going to try to leg drag her leg lasso hook, or he's going to try to drive his knee underneath the hamstring and pry the leg lasso hook out. And that's like a rough approximation of some of the situations that are likely to happen in that scenario. And if something else happens in that scenario, it's nothing to make too big a fuss over, but that's something that you should sort of bookmark in your head. Like, okay, well, what is the unusual thing that happened in the scenario? And then what can I learn from that? Is that something that is likely to happen repeatedly and it's something I just hadn't factored in? Or, for example, before 6 or 7 years ago, if you get on top of the mount, usually you would predict that the bottom player is going to try to elbow escape, or they're going to try to do some sort of bridging and rolling turn to reverse the person on top. A lot of the time with an underhook around the back, though sometimes with an arm framing across the hips. And if the bump and roll fails, oftentimes the person on top takes the back or attacks with an arm bar. So you can kind of predict how that's going to go. In no-gi, similar thing, up until about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But then people started doing kipping escapes, which changes things. So if you 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, if you had been in that mount situation and you had an answer for all of those problems and you had predicted, okay, well, I'm on top of the mount, probably going to play out like this. These are the things that are likely to happen next. Or you're watching somebody else there and you predict it, and then you see somebody do the kipping escape. It just doesn't make sense. Like, what are you doing? How did you end up in that footlock position? And so you bookmark that for later study, and then see if that turns into a trend. And then when it does turn into a trend, that becomes factored in to your 3 or 4 things that you can reasonably predict are going to happen in that situation. So prediction is another tool that you can use. And again, it's not important to be 100% accurate. You do want to try to work towards a greater percentage of accuracy, but it's never going to be 100%. It's just about trying to be more accurate than you were before, and that sort of tests your knowledge, general knowledge of a position. Another thing that you can do when you're watching to keep yourself mentally engaged, this is especially true of footage, because with footage you can rewind, fast forward, and you don't have to remember as accurately. But when you look at footage and you see something noteworthy happen that you want to study, you can ask yourself, okay, what led to that happening? Why did that outcome happen? So for example, with the kipping escape from the mount, you watch somebody in video who's on top of the mount. Maybe they have their ankles crossed and their hips are thrusted forward, a lot of hip pressure forward, and the person on bottom puts both hands in the hips and starts lifting their legs off the mat, starts hopping their hips up, and then they escape into a footlock position. What led to that? Why was the person on bottom successful? What were the things that allowed them mechanically to get out of that position? So for the person on bottom, the more you watch, the more you notice, okay, well, the hands have to be on the hips, right? They need something to frame with. Because if there's no hands on the hips, not that it's not possible, but if there's no hands on the hips and you start kipping on bottom, much of the time, the person on top will simply start sliding north up into the armpits with their knees to a higher mount position. So there has to be something that stops the knees from sliding north into a higher mount position. And then, okay, so let's say that the hands are part of what lead you there. That might be one of the dead giveaways in the beginning. And then what else has to happen? So the legs have to lift off the mat, and there has to be some sort of car jack kind of motion that elevates the top person's hips off of the bottom person's hips, or at least separates the hips. Maybe the person on top's hips don't have to move straight up, but they do have to separate from the person on bottom's hips. And so the frames do that, keeping distance, but what actually makes the distance in the first place? I think the kipping motion is what makes the distance in the first place. Well, how does that work? So when somebody lifts their legs up and start kipping, then since they're not planting their feet on the ground to bridge, it's not a bridging mechanic that does the work, at least in many cases. I think I have seen hybrid versions where people do bridge and then put the feet back down on the ground. But by and large, you generally see people do it by picking their feet off the ground and then using small shaking motions while framing with their hands or their elbows on the person on top's hips or ribs. So anyway, you start looking at the mechanics of what led to that outcome. Okay, how did that happen? Well, what happened first? What actually happened? What did the person on bottom do? Well, they separated the person on top's hips from their hips and got their legs in between themselves and their partner. How did that happen? Well, arms frame, legs generate momentum somehow or generate force. And then you start digging deeper and deeper and deeper into the mechanics of it. And then what was the end result? So the person on top ends up in a footlock position, usually single ashi, although sometimes, depending on how far into a butterfly guard or an X guard it goes, they might end up in like honey hole or some sort of X guard, reverse X that leads to that. So the outcome was that the person on bottom escaped from the full mount and ended up in a footlock position. How did the person on top react when the person on bottom was escaping? So what did the person on top do when the person on bottom was using the kipping escape? What did they do during the opening stages of it? What did they do during the kipping escape? What did they do after the kipping escape? So when they ended up in the footlock position, how did they react to that? Where did the game go from there? And you can really glean a lot of insight by looking at what actually happened and then breaking apart the mechanics of how those things worked. And by mechanics, I mean the mechanical pieces of what led to that outcome, what somebody's body mechanically was doing to lead to that outcome. One way to think about it is if the person on bottom is doing a kipping escape, then their body becomes a machine that is designed to separate their hips from their partner's hips and then insert their legs in between their hips and their partner's hips. So how does the machine work? Mechanically, breaking apart a toaster, you have some sort of spring mechanism that pushes the toast down. You have some sort of heating mechanism. There has to be some sort of energy source, right? You plug it into the wall. And you know, there's a lot of components to a toaster. But if you wanted to understand how a toaster works, how to break a toaster, how to fix a toaster, sorry buddy, then you would open a toaster up, look at the mechanics of it, try to understand how each piece mechanically works, and then reverse engineer from there. And so similarly, that's kind of what I'm advocating for with looking at the mechanical versions of a technique. So if we look at that kipping escape again, you're looking mechanically, what does the kipping machine look like? What are your partner's arms doing? What are the bottom person's legs doing? What is their spine doing? What are all the important mechanical pieces of the body doing? At least on a surface level in the beginning, first pass. After the first pass, then you can start to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. What is somebody's, neck doing? What is their lower back doing? What are their shoulder blades doing? But in the beginning, look at the arms, the legs, and the spine from top of the skull down to the bottom of the tailbone. And then you get a sense of the basic rudiments of the machine and what the machine is basically made of. And then build off of that. So go from there to the next layer of that. So that is another way to get some benefit out of, some mental benefit out of studying video footage, is to try to understand the action that happened, what led to the action happening, what happened during the action, what the consequences of the action were, and then what the person who was the recipient of the action, what was their reaction to it? How did they respond? How did they respond physically? Did they do anything deliberate to counter it? Was it all just instinct and reaction? Were they unprepared for it? All those kind of things. And again, this is something that you want to do over and over and over again. You're not going to get complete information on your first pass studying video of something like this. But your second pass, your third pass, your fourth pass, each layer of the pass, you'll gain more and more insight into these things, and you'll learn a little bit more about what's going on, because you'll have time to get the rough sketch of it, digest it a little bit, maybe go to open mat later, experiment with a little bit so you can gain some physical insight into, well, how does this actually feel when I'm trying to do it? And then take that insight and do a second pass of your video study and see what you can glean from that secondary insight. And then just keep on rinsing, washing, repeating that. So those are a few mental tips that you can do to study jiu-jitsu when you're off the mat, when you're injured, or during your downtime when you're bored or whatever. There's a lot more, but those are three pretty simple, sorry, I got hiccups, pretty simple ones that I think pretty much anybody can do. All right, well, I'm gonna go skateboarding. I may talk to you later afterwards if I got more stuff to say, but if I don't, hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you later. All right, I'm back again. I got a little bit more to say. So I realized I just listened to the video I just filmed, and I didn't really go too deep into some of the ideas I have about that first piece of advice about putting yourself in the person that you're watching's shoes. So on a surface level, this is simply just imagining, okay, if I was in Janine's shoes when I was on top of the mount and somebody's doing the kipping escape to me, how would I react to that? And that's like a basic level, right? And then there's going a little bit deeper where, you know, maybe you have a lot of experience in that position and you can say, okay, well, I've been there before. I know what that pressure feels like when somebody puts their hands on the hips. And so when I feel that pressure, what would I do there? Well, I think I could probably sit up and then push the hands off my hips before they get a real connection to my hips. And then the more experience you have, the more you can kind of dig deeper and deeper into, I guess, like really visualizing what that experience feels like and really putting yourself deeper and deeper into that person's shoes. And I think going, you know, into watching film study like that is super useful, because that's almost, you know, if you have a lot of experience in jiu-jitsu or in a certain position, you can really get, you know, it's not the same as actually physically training a position from what I understand, but I think it's, you know, can be pretty close, or at least you can get significant value. Sorry, that's the L way up there. You can get significant value out of putting yourself in that person's shoes and doing like empathy reps, I guess you could call it, and getting like deep visualization out of that practice of watching film study and just imagining yourself in that person's shoes. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is modeling an athlete. So for example, when I was in the middle 2000s, when I was in my 20s, I would watch a lot of Marcelo Garcia footage, and I would try to put myself in his shoes when I would watch his matches and just imagine, like, you know, again, what it would feel like to do those techniques. Try to imagine, you know, feel the nuances of what his guillotine felt like or whatever. But then also try to mirror his intensity when he was doing stuff. So like modeling, and then take that imprint that I get from watching tons of footage of him, and then when I would go and train, I would kind of like pretend like I was Marcelo Garcia, and I would notice that my rolling would tend to be a little bit more explosive, and I would tend to like unconsciously try to move more like him. And you know, like obviously I'm not Marcelo Garcia, and I don't really move anything like him. That's a cool backdrop right there. But what I'm saying is that, you know, just like a little kid who maybe grew up watching Michael Jordan, and then they go play basketball and they try to imagine that they're Michael Jordan, you can do the same thing watching footage of grapplers and put yourself in their shoes. Imagine that you're that grappler, and you'll not only will you gain some technical insights into their game and what makes their game successful, but you can get a sense of maybe other aspects that you hadn't considered besides the purely mechanical, like their timing, speed with which they execute their techniques, explosiveness, just general like kind of movement. Some people have more like, I don't know, crisp movement, I guess, and clear movement, and then other people have more kind of like shaky, aggressive, wild movement. And you can gain some sort of like, I don't know, it's almost like mirroring somebody's accent. Like, you know, maybe actors and actresses, when they're studying a role, maybe they look at a character like, I don't know, if I was trying to study a role of like, you know, do like the life of Al Pacino or something, then, you know, you might start studying like his physical mannerisms, the technical components of how he moves, the stuff that he did in his life, and then, you know, get maybe a sense of what his accent is like, what are the components of the accent, and really break down vividly what Al Pacino's like personality, both physically and verbally and mentally, is like, and then do and you know, and then I guess act like him. And I think maybe kind of the same thing with grappling, where, you know, you watch Marcelo Garcia footage, and you know, maybe you try to copy the techniques, and then try to glean insights as to like, you know, is it just the techniques that made him successful, or are there, you know, was it his explosiveness, or were there elements of, you know, maybe his personality, like being laser focused and hyper aggressive and constantly attacking, something less tangible like that. And when you try to model yourself after an athlete in training and try to act like them and try to move like them and try to do their techniques, then I think you can gain a lot of insight into maybe what made them successful, and then you can cherry pick the things that made them successful and see what you can fit into your game and what doesn't fit into your game. You know, sometimes it's really interesting because there's layers to that, right? So for me, for example, I'm not by nature an explosive athlete. So, you know, studying somebody like Marcelo Garcia, I could mimic some of the techniques, and obviously not being super explosive, there's some things I just couldn't, I couldn't even get anywhere near the same level of success, and they didn't even begin to work for me, because I just don't move the same way that he does as far as explosiveness and timing and, you know, persistent aggression. But there's some things that work very well for me, and there's some things that I think, you know, he was successful with not because of the way he moved, but because on a technical level, the positions and techniques were just superior and could be done with a different movement style, different personality style. And then there's some things that I think are more unique to him and people who move like him. And you know, by doing a lot of modeling and pretending to be Marcelo Garcia in training, I got a little bit of insight into what some of those things are. And I think, you know, the other thing too that's actually was a really valuable benefit for me of that practice of modeling myself after an athlete was, like, sometimes in competition, you know, you model yourself after somebody like Roger Gracie or Marcelo Garcia, and you know, maybe even do some self-talk about it, like, okay, you know, I'm the best, I can't be beaten, I'm a champion, stuff like that. Even if you're not, and you can kind of piggyback off of their confidence a little bit, maybe, just by sort of wearing, I don't know, it's again, going back to the little kid thing, it's like when a little kid dresses up as a superhero, or, you know, somebody that they admire, and they gain confidence by doing that, you know, like maybe they're getting bullied in school or something, and, you know, they wear their favorite like Wolverine t-shirt, and then that gives them confidence, and they go and, you know, stand up to the bully. I think that's sort of, you know, maybe a childish way of putting it. Not childish in a bad sense, but like childish, like actually what, you know, children would do unconsciously to, like, you know, gain confidence. But I think maybe that's another aspect of it, where you're putting yourself in that athlete's shoes and you're modeling yourself after them and sort of piggybacking or borrowing their cape so that you can gain confidence. And then sometimes that confidence is what you need to win. Sometimes that confidence, you know, you see Marcelo Garcia, how he used to play the X guard and sweep a lot of really good people with it. And so when you're an X guard, you know, you think to yourself, okay, I'm in my position, nobody can beat me here. And, you know, you maybe visualize, like, you know, yourself as Marcelo Garcia or Roger Gracie on top of the mount, and it gives you that intangible sense of confidence that can be the difference between making a technique successful and not being successful with a technique or a position. That kind of, you know, it's what's interesting about that, some people gain that confidence on their own. They never have to borrow it from anybody, and the confidence for them comes from, you know, from success, and then they build on that success, and they have more and more success, and they build their own natural confidence that's sort of self-generated. And then there's other people that need devices like modeling or fake it till you make it kind of confidence boosters to sort of almost like when you build a fire and you have that first like tinder that you light with the spark. You know, the tinder and the spark might just be that first thing, that little fake it till you make it confidence that you can then, you know, blow some air on and add small pieces of wood and build that into a bigger fire and a bigger fire until you're actually truly confident, and it's self-generated and it's built on true experience that you can, you know, you can be confident because you have accomplished many things yourself, rather than, you know, being confident because you've, you know, talked yourself up. I think the fake it till you make it, or the self-talk, or the modeling, that can be the tinder and the spark that gets a good fire of confidence built. So, I wonder what this person's doing. Oh, maybe they're parking. So that's another way to look at it, that putting yourself in the athlete's shoes kind of thing. So I think there's a lot to this, and this is a mental skill that I guess in some ways it's all sort of tied in. All mental skills are sort of tied in with visualization to a certain extent. The putting yourself in another athlete's shoes, I think, is especially tied into visualization, because when you're putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, you're actually mentally going to that place that they are at, and or putting yourself in your own shoes and mentally going to that space where you were in a previous match or another situation, and getting mental repetition, or sort of mentally fishing around a position or a technique or whatever. All right, what's this guy doing? One interesting thing about that, a friend of mine sent me an article years ago, and he sent me a little email about it as well. And he's a sport exercise and sport science professor, or was formerly. And he mentioned to me that visualization, the more experience you have in a position or in a situation, the more you're going to get out of visualization. So for example, if you're a novice in a position, when I first started doing berimbolo, for example, I knew next to nothing about it. All right. When I first started doing berimbolo, I had next to no experience in that position. So my visualization was really not that high def. The image of the repetitions that I was doing in my head it wasn't really like fine-tuned. I couldn't really feel the important parts of it. I couldn't feel each piece of it. I couldn't feel like where the pressure was here or the grips were there. And I couldn't really get good reps out of my visualization because I didn't have the experience to back it up. However, as I gained experience, or when I would visualize other things that I have more experience in, I could then piggyback off of that experience and imagine myself in more and more high definition versions of that. So for example, a position like closed guard, which I've spent 18 years playing closed guard, arm bars from closed guard, I have years and years and years of experience and repetition doing those. And so I can vividly imagine myself doing an arm bar from closed guard pretty much anytime. And I can get good repetition mentally of the mechanics of an arm bar, what it feels like when I'm doing it sparring to different body types, to different specific people in my memory, the problems that I come across, what people actually do to shut my arm bar down, solutions to those problems, with pretty good definition. Sometimes, picturing what the actual lighting in the room is like if I'm doing an arm bar, or, I don't know, what certain smells are like, what the certain different types of gis feel like when I'm trying to do arm bars. You can get a pretty high def impression, and so what that means is that, of course, visualization is never the same thing as actually being there and doing live repetition and sparring with somebody. But if you have a lot of experience and you can really put yourself in that situation, then you can get some good work out of it. And that means that you can train any place, anytime, if you can get good repetition mentally by visualizing. So anyway, that's sort of a thought to continue what I was talking about earlier in the first video. I'm going to leave you with that. Oh, that's a strange tree. Or maybe it's just chopped strangely. Well, anyway, I'm going to leave you with that. Have a nice weekend. Talk to you soon. Bye.